Why's a man in a three-piece suit lying face down in a landfill outside Detroit? Someone left him there to die. A struggling single mother who spent her days digging through industrial waste just to afford her daughter's asthma inhaler found a mafia boss, beaten half to death, and dumped like garbage between rusted metal and broken glass. That discovery would drag her into a world she never knew existed and change both their lives forever. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If this story hits you the way we think it will, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to that scorching afternoon in the wasteland outside Detroit, where the sun was pounding down on mountains of scrap metal and rotting debris, and a 27-year-old woman named Brielle Lawson was picking through the wreckage with blood on her hands and desperation in her bones. Brielle had been out at the landfill since early morning, when the sun still hadn't fully climbed. But now the light poured straight down onto the crown of her head as if it meant to melt everything beneath it, and sweat ran in thin streams along her spine, soaking into a t-shirt so faded she couldn't even remember what color it used to be. A few steps away, Poppy sat in the old stroller Brielle had pulled from a trash bin behind the Walmart supermarket 3 months ago, the 4-year-old wearing a cloth mask her mother had cut from an old shirt to block some of the stench, her wide eyes fixed on her mother at work with a patience no child that age should ever have to learn. Last night had been hell. Poppy's asthma attack had hit at 2 o'clock in the morning, her breathing sounding like a whistle forced through a metal pipe, and Brielle had scooped her up and run into the bathroom, cranking the hot water all the way so the steam would open her airways, because the albuterol inhaler had been empty for 3 days. She'd sat on the mildewed bathroom floor for 4 hours, holding her child, listening to every breath like each one might be the last, counting the minutes in her head until daylight finally came. $30. That was all she needed to buy a new inhaler at the pharmacy, but $30 here was as luxurious as $30,000 anywhere else. Brielle had no health insurance, no family, no one calling to ask how she'd made it through the day. Her mother had died of lung cancer when she was 19, and her father had vanished with a cheap bottle of whiskey before she'd learned how to read. The man who'd gotten her pregnant with Poppy had walked out the moment he saw the test strip turn to 2 lines, and she hadn't heard his voice since. All she had was a leaky trailer on the edge of an industrial dump outside Detroit, a 4-year-old daughter with chronic asthma, and hands crisscrossed with cuts from sorting scrap metal every day just to sell enough for a few dollars. She bent down and dragged a heavy sheet of rusted tin aside to see if anything underneath might be worth something, and the instant the tin flipped over, she saw it. A man's hand reached out from the heap, long fingers, strangely clean amid all that filth, and on his wrist a gold watch flashed in the sun with an almost insulting brightness in a place like this. Brielle's heart jolted. She backed up on instinct, her grip tightening around the iron rod in her hand like a weapon. She shoved more trash aside, and the full shape of him emerged. A tall man lay face down, wearing a black 3-piece suit that was now torn and smeared with mud and dried blood, his sharp-featured face bruised and swollen, and a deep wound at his left temple, where the blood had clotted into a dark, hardened crust. He looked like a king ripped off his throne and thrown into a gutter. Brielle's first instinct was to run, because she knew better than anyone that a man lying in a dump outside Detroit could be anything. An addict, a criminal, a killer, and none of it was safe for a single mother with a small child. But just as she started to turn away, Poppy pointed at the man and said, her voice clear through the cloth mask, "Mom, he's hurt." Brielle froze, looked at her daughter, then looked at the motionless man, and she knew that if she walked away, she'd have to live with that image every night when she looked into Poppy's eyes. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressed 2 fingers to his neck for a pulse, and found it, weak but there, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Brielle's gaze snapped across the landfill, sweeping the horizon she knew too well, the place where illegal scrap buyers worked every afternoon. And if they saw the watch on this man's wrist, they wouldn't just take it. They'd finish him off so there'd be no witness. They'd done it to others before, and she'd seen the bloodstains on stone that no one ever bothered to explain. The sun still burned like fire. Poppy kept watching her, waiting, and Brielle made a decision she knew would change everything. She slid her arms under the man's shoulders, clenched her teeth, hauled him out of the trash, and started dragging that body, twice her weight, toward the stroller where Poppy sat. Each step was a battle with gravity and exhaustion, but Brielle Lawson had been fighting things bigger than herself for a long time. Brielle found an old tarp rolled up under a stack of rotting wooden pallets nearby, spread it out, then rolled the man onto it, gripping the two corners tight and starting to pull, because there was no way on earth she could carry a body at least twice her weight all the way back to the trailer. Poppy trotted along beside her, little plastic sandals slapping against the cracked, dry ground, and every so often she'd stop to pick up a pebble or a bottle cap, then hurry after her mother again, as if this were just another ordinary afternoon in her small life. Brielle didn't take the main path. She knew the drug crew worked the empty lot near the landfill exit every evening, and if they saw her dragging an unconscious man wearing a gold watch, it would end fast, and it would end badly for all three of them. She chose the shortcut behind the row of abandoned shipping containers, slipped through the gap between two strands of barbed wire fencing she'd cut long ago for the time she needed to avoid trouble, and dragged the tarp over gravel and broken stones, through puddles of pitch-black water that reeked of chemicals she didn't want to name. Her shoulder burned from the friction, the skin on her palms peeled raw, but she didn't stop, because the sky was dimming and the long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the ground like fingers reaching to grab them. The man made a faint sound every time the tarp bumped over a pothole or a sharp rock, and Brielle told herself that at least the sound meant he was still alive. Silence was what she feared. When she finally hauled him to the door of the trailer, her arms shook so badly she could barely work the lock. She braced the door with her knee, dragged him inside, and with what little strength she had left, shoved him onto the only sofa in the trailer, an old floral couch worn and torn, the same couch she slept on every night, because the one small crib in the corner was for Poppy. She sat on the floor for a moment, gasping for air, then got up, told Poppy to stay put on the crib, and ran next door to knock on Odette's trailer. Odette opened the door with a crutch tucked under her right arm, because her left leg had been gone below the knee since her service in Iraq. Her eyes fixed on Brielle, full of questions, but she didn't speak until Brielle said, "There's someone dying in my trailer, ma'am." Odette didn't ask anything else. She turned back inside and came out with a dull gray tin box she'd kept since her army days, a battlefield first aid kit that had followed her through 2 deployments in the Middle East, suturing needles still sealed sterile, military gauze, betadine antiseptic, and a pair of cloth scissors, sharp as a knife. Odette hopped along with Brielle back to the trailer, took one look at the man on the couch, and her eyes narrowed the way an old soldier's eyes narrow when she's reading a situation in the middle of a fight. She sat beside him, set the tin on the table, and went to work with steady hands that didn't tremble even at 67. She cut away the fabric, stuck to the wound at his temple, cleaned the dried blood with betadine, and began stitching with small, even passes, the kind of calm only someone who's sewn flesh under gunfire can carry. The man groaned, and his body jerked each time the needle pierced skin, but he didn't wake. Odette watched as she worked, her gaze lingering on the wound, sliding over the bruised face, and she shook her head slowly, telling Brielle that this wasn't an accident, not a fall, not a car impact. This was a deliberate blow from a hard object. Someone had struck straight into his temple with the intent to kill, not to warn. Then she lifted his wrist, turned it over, and pointed to a small tattoo on the inside, a fine, intricate mark most people wouldn't notice, but Odette had seen enough in the hard parts of Detroit to know exactly what world it belonged to. She looked Brielle in the eyes and said in a low, steady voice, "Girl, this one isn't a working man. Look at his hands. No calluses. Look at that mark. It's criminal. You're bringing a wolf into your home. I'm not saying it to scare you. I'm saying it so you know what you're doing." Brielle swallowed. She knew Odette was right. Everything about him said danger. The expensive 3-piece suit, the solid gold watch, soft hands untouched by work, the underworld tattoo, the intentional wound. All of it screamed that she should drag him back outside and pretend she'd never seen him. But just as she opened her mouth to answer Odette, she glanced toward the corner of the trailer and saw that Poppy had climbed out of the crib without anyone noticing. She was sitting by the end of the sofa, pressing a wet cloth to the stranger's forehead with her tiny hands, offering a gentleness only a child can give without needing a reason. Poppy looked up at her mother and said, "He's really hot, Mom. I'm cooling him down." Brielle stood there, staring at her daughter, a 4-year-old with severe asthma and no insurance, living in a leaking trailer at the edge of a dump, and still carrying enough love to care for a stranger. And Brielle understood that if she threw this man back outside, she wouldn't just be killing him. She'd be killing something inside Poppy, too. the very thing Brielle had fought to protect at all costs for 4 years. She turned back to Odette and said, "I know, ma'am, but I can't." Odette held her gaze for a long time, then let out a breath, nodded once, and went back to finish the last stitch on the man's forehead, and both of them knew it might be the biggest mistake they'd ever make, or the most right thing they'd ever done. The man opened his eyes at midnight, when the trailer was sunk in darkness, and only a muddy yellow glow from the street lamp outside slipped through the crack in the window curtain. And his first reaction wasn't panic. It was to sweep his gaze across the space and assess it, an instinct so sharp it worked before conscious thought, as if his body had been programmed to control every situation before his mind even caught up. But his body wouldn't obey. When he tried to sit up, a ripping pain tore from his temple down the back of his neck, and he fell onto the sofa again with a groan he couldn't stop. His eyes adjusted to the dark, and he saw her. A woman sat on the floor beside an old crib in the corner, her back against the wall, her head slightly tilted toward the child sleeping inside. Her eyes were ringed with bruised shadows like someone who hadn't slept in a long time, and there was dried blood on her hands, blood he didn't know the source of, but something in him told him it was his. He opened his mouth, and his voice came out rough as sandpaper on stone. "Where am I?" The woman didn't turn to look at him. She stayed where she was, eyes fixed on the child's breathing, and answered in a flat voice with no extra emotion. "In my trailer on the edge of an industrial dump outside Detroit, and you owe me an explanation for why I had to drag a body twice my weight 1/2 mile to get you here." He wanted to answer, but when he reached into his mind, he found only a black wall. No name, no face, no address, no memory. Nothing but a vast, icy emptiness he'd fallen into like a bottomless well. He couldn't remember who he was, couldn't remember why he was here, couldn't remember who had hit him. And that feeling was 100 times more terrifying than the pain in his head, because at least pain told him he was alive, but the void in his memory couldn't even tell him what he was. His hand rose without thinking to rub his forehead, his wrist brushing his face, his fingers touching the gold watch still strapped to him, and when he turned it over, the streetlight gave him just enough to read the small engraving on the back. T.G. King of Nothing. The initials T.G. looked familiar, but they sparked nothing except a distant echo in his skull, like someone calling his name from the far side of a wall he couldn't find a door through. King of Nothing. A joke, maybe, but he couldn't laugh, because he really was a king of nothing. No name, no past, no present. He lay there staring at the trailer ceiling, paint peeling in flakes, until he slipped under again through the pain, and when he woke the next time, daylight had flooded through every crack in the old trailer, and the woman stood in front of him with the child on her hip, watching him with eyes that held neither warmth nor cruelty, only the practical steadiness of someone used to facing what no one wanted to face. She said, "My name's Brielle. This is Poppy, my daughter. You're lying on my bed, and I don't know who you are, but I've got 3 rules. 1. You sleep on that sofa, and you never touch my child. 2. You don't go outside during the day, because I don't want trouble. 3. If you want to eat, you work, because nobody eats for free here." He listened, and something stirred inside his instincts, an old habit he didn't recognize as habit. He looked straight into her eyes and said, his voice still raw but carrying an unconscious authority, "I need to make a phone call first. Let me use your phone." Brielle didn't blink. She looked at him the way you look at a stray dog trying to growl while it's flattened on the ground, and she cut him off with a voice cold as steel. "You're not a king here. There's no phone here because I can't afford the bill. If you want to call someone, you can walk to the payphone 2 miles from here, but looking at your legs, you can't make it 2 steps, so you'd better sit still and listen to me." He went silent, not out of fear, but out of shock. The feeling of being cut off mid-sentence was foreign, like no one had ever dared do it, and his body's reaction confirmed that. His jaw muscles clenched, his back straightened despite the pain, his eyes narrowed on her with an intensity that should have made anyone else step back. But Brielle Lawson didn't. She'd faced debt collectors pounding on her door at midnight, a drunk ex slamming on her trailer demanding money, an emergency room doctor looking at her with contempt when she carried her child in without insurance. She didn't back down from anyone, and she sure as hell wouldn't back down from a man sprawled on her sofa who owed her his life. They stared at each other in silence, the air between them thick as the moment before a storm. It wasn't romantic spark. It was a collision between 2 people who were used to controlling everything around them, One who controlled with power he no longer remembered, and one who controlled with survival she'd forged for 27 years. Poppy broke the tension by waving at him from her mother's hip and saying in a bright, innocent voice, "Are you done hurting, mister? You slept a lot." And for the first time since he'd opened his eyes in this trailer, the nameless man felt something softer than survival brush against his chest, even though he didn't yet know what to call it. The first day Brielle took him out to the landfill to work, everything turned into a disaster, because the man's hands were soft like a child's, hands that had never touched anything rougher than the surface of a polished wooden desk, and within the first half hour he'd been cut 3 times, by sharp tin edges, blood running down his fingers and dripping onto the pile of scrap he was trying to sort under Brielle's instructions. She taught him how to tell copper from aluminum, how to strip electrical wire to get the copper core inside, how to recognize what could be sold and what had to be thrown out. And he listened with fierce concentration, but his hands were so clumsy Brielle had to look away so she wouldn't sigh right in his face. Poppy was the one who kept rushing in to rescue him every time he got hurt, digging into her little backpack to pull out a roll of tape and a few band-aids Brielle always kept for her, sticking them onto his fingers, patting them down with her tiny palm, and saying in the familiar voice of a child who'd had to comfort herself too many times, "It's okay, mister. Mom gets hurt all the time. Mom gets hurt more than you." That made him look up at Brielle's hands as they worked fast, stripping wire, and for the first time he truly saw them. Thin fingers crisscrossed with scars, old and new layered together, nails cut down to the quick, patches of tender pink skin not yet healed beside calluses hard as stone, and he felt ashamed, sharp and clear, cutting straight through the wall of his amnesia, even though he didn't understand how a man who didn't remember who he was could feel shame in front of the hands of a strange woman. But he only lowered his head and kept working without a word. By afternoon, Brielle gave him the job of fixing the leak in the trailer roof, because every night water dripped onto the floor, and he climbed up with an old hammer and a few sheets of tin for patching. The strange thing was that when he looked at the damage, his head began calculating on its own, the slope, the drainage point, where to place the patch for the best effect, as if one part of his brain operated separately and didn't need memory. He sealed the leak, then replaced the broken door hinge, fixed the leaking pipe under the sink with movements so precise that Odette stood outside the door watching, then shook her head and told Brielle, "This one fixes things like an engineer, but he holds a hammer like it's the first time he's ever touched one," which means his head knows, but his hands have never had to do it. And a man like that is either a professor or a boss, not a laborer. Brielle didn't comment, but she took note, adding another piece to the picture of the man lying on her sofa that she still couldn't put together. Out of everything that surprised her, what surprised Brielle most was Poppy, a child who was usually shy with strangers, a child who clung to her mother's leg every time they went to the community clinic and refused to look at anyone, and yet she wasn't afraid of this man at all. Poppy climbed onto the sofa and sat beside him as if he'd been there since before she was born. She told him rambling stories with no beginning or end, about the stray cat out by the dump, about a cloud shaped like an elephant she'd seen yesterday. She made him draw pictures with a dull pencil and the back of an old flyer. Then she taught him the names of butterflies she'd read in an old book she'd found in the trash. Monarch butterfly, blue butterfly, lemon yellow butterfly. He listened to her with a strange, steady patience, and when she told him to draw a butterfly, he picked up the pencil and his hand moved across the paper in smooth, natural lines, effortless, as if it didn't need thought at all. The wings appeared so vivid that Poppy squealed and clapped. Then she told him, "Draw Poppy," and he studied her for a long moment before he began to sketch. The round eyes, the mess of curly hair, the huge grin, and when Brielle came home that night and saw the portrait on the back of the flyer, she stood still for a long time. Because it was so beautiful she couldn't believe a dull pencil and a piece of trash paper could make something that made her want to cry. She didn't say anything about the drawing, but she slipped it between the pages of a book under Poppy's pillow. At night, when Brielle walked 20 minutes to the small diner where she washed dishes for pay, he stayed behind to watch Poppy, and it was the first time in the part of his life he could remember, even if it was only a few short days, that he carried full responsibility for a child. Poppy stayed awake waiting for her mother, and he didn't know what else to do except sit beside the crib the way he'd seen Brielle do every night. He told her stories he made up on the spot because he had no memories to tell, and Poppy listened with wide eyes that slowly grew heavy until they finally closed. and her tiny hand curled around his finger in her sleep. He sat there afraid to move, afraid he'd wake her. And in the darkness of the torn-up trailer, he felt something heavier than responsibility pressing on his chest. Something he suspected his life before this, whatever it had been missing for a long time. That night, Brielle got home later than usual because the diner had been packed, and the owner made her wash 2 more final batches of pots before she could leave. So she walked the familiar unlit road from the restaurant back to the trailer park, with legs that ached to the bone and hands wrinkled from soaking in soapy water for 5 straight hours, thinking of nothing except checking on Poppy, and then collapsing on the floor for a few hours of sleep before dawn. But when she arrived, the trailer was pitch black, and the door stood open. The crib was empty, the sofa was empty, and her heart dropped into her stomach like a stone. She ran to Odette's trailer. Odette said Poppy had an asthma attack about an hour earlier and he had picked her up and run, and Odette hadn't been able to stop him. Brielle demanded to know where, and Odette said toward the community clinic. Brielle ran. She didn't just walk fast. She ran, and somewhere along the road her flip-flops flew off her feet, but she didn't stop to pick them up. She ran barefoot over cracked asphalt for nearly 20 minutes, until she saw the sickly white fluorescent lights of the community clinic. She burst inside and shouted her daughter's name, but the receptionist told her to calm down. The child was in the back and she was stable. Brielle sprinted down the hallway, and at the far end of the row of plastic chairs outside the emergency room, she saw him. The nameless man sat on a white plastic chair with Poppy in his arms. Poppy was asleep with a nebulizer mask over her face, and he sat perfectly still, holding her with both hands, his eyes red, a wet streak on his cheek he hadn't bothered to wipe away. Brielle stopped at the head of the hallway, and everything she'd been about to say, every accusation, every question, why didn't you bring Odette? Why did you take my child in the middle of the night without telling anyone? All of it dissolved, because she saw the blanket on his lap, the one she wrapped Poppy in every night. He'd bundled her in it before he ran, and that meant that even in panic he'd remembered to grab a blanket, because Detroit nights were cold. She went to him and sat down on the plastic chair beside him without a word, and they sat in silence beneath the fluorescent lights, listening to the steady hum of the nebulizer machine. Then he set his hand on her shoulder, gentle, no grip, no squeeze, just resting there as if to say she's okay now, and you don't have to be strong anymore. Not for this moment. Brielle didn't pull away. For the first time since he'd entered her life, she let that hand stay on her shoulder, and she closed her eyes and let out a long breath, as if she'd been holding it for 4 years. The receptionist told her what had happened when he carried Poppy in earlier, that the staff had demanded paperwork and insurance first, but he'd looked the worker straight in the eye and said in a voice the receptionist described as the voice of a man who wasn't used to being refused, "Treat her now, or I'll make sure this place can't open tomorrow." And the frightening part was that no one in the room doubted he meant it, so they treated Poppy immediately. Brielle listened and understood that kind of authority wasn't something you learned. It grew out of bone and blood. And even if he didn't remember who he was, the shadow of the man he'd been was still large enough to make an entire emergency room obey. 3 days later, when Poppy had fully recovered and was running around the trailer as if nothing had happened, Odette knocked with her crutch, and a serious look Brielle rarely saw on her face. Odette said that yesterday at the flea market and the scrap yards on the east side, several men in black had been driving a black SUV and asking questions everywhere. They didn't ask the police, didn't go to any station. They went straight into places. Only the black market crowd knew. Asking about a missing man. Tall, dark hair, possibly injured, and they didn't look like family searching for a loved one. They looked like hunters tracking prey. He listened, and his face changed, not with fear, but with a cold alertness rising from inside him, the instinct of an animal that knows it's being hunted. He stood and told Brielle he had to go. He didn't know who he was, but he knew the people looking for him weren't good, and if they found him here, Brielle and Poppy would be in danger. Brielle looked him up and down, looked at the leg that still limped because the injury hadn't fully healed, looked at the old clothes she'd lent him hanging loose on his frame, looked at the bruises still staining his face, and she said in a voice so practical it bordered on cruel, "You've got no name, no money, no memory, no papers. You walk out that gate, and you'll be dead before you make it 2 blocks, not because of those men, but because you don't even know which way leads to the highway." Odette nodded slowly, and added in the calm voice of someone who'd spent her whole life in places society forgot, "Poor people are invisible, son. Men in black SUVs will never come all the way here because to them this place doesn't exist on a map. You're safer here than anywhere else as long as you keep your face in the shadows and that watch in your pocket. He looked at the two women, one old, one young, both thin, both carrying the scars of life, and yet both standing straight in front of him with a courage he suspected he'd never seen in anyone in whatever life he'd lived before, even if he couldn't remember what that life was. And he sat back down on the old sofa, accepting that his fate now rested in the hands of two women on the edge of a dump outside Detroit. The first dream came on the fourth night after Odette warned them about the men in black, and it didn't arrive like a normal dream. It came like a door being kicked open inside his head. He saw himself seated at the end of a long, glossy conference table, crystal chandelier light spilling across dark wood. Around him were blurred figures without faces, but he knew they were watching him, and he knew he was the most important person in that room, even though he didn't understand why. A woman with long black hair stepped to his side. She was beautiful, but something in her smile made his instincts recoil. She poured liquor into his glass and said something he couldn't quite hear, but her voice was sweet in a way that tasted false. Then a man appeared behind him, clapped his shoulder and laughed, a wide, confident laugh that was too friendly. The hand on his shoulder heavy and warm, but there was something in the man's eyes he caught in the instant before the glass touched his mouth. Something cold and calculating. Then the bitterness on his tongue. Not the bitterness of liquor, but the bitterness of something that didn't belong there. The room spun. The chandelier blurred. The tabletop tilted. And darkness swallowed everything. He jerked upright on the sofa, drenched in sweat, heart hammering, and a name tore out of his mouth before his mind could catch up. Paxton. The name rang through the dark trailer and he didn't know who it was, but his chest tightened when he said it, as if his body remembered what his head had forgotten. Brielle woke on the floor and looked at him, but she didn't ask questions. She only reached for the small, hard-covered notebook she'd found at the dump the week before and handed it to him with the dull pencil, telling him, "Write it down. Write everything you can remember, even if it's only one word." Then she turned her back and went back to sleep, as if this were just another small nuisance in the night. He wrote Paxton on the first page and stared at the name until morning. After that, the dreams came more often. Each time a small piece fell loose from the black wall in his mind, like broken brick from a cracked barrier. He saw his own signature on legal documents, the handwriting strong and decisive, and beneath it the printed words Galletti Holdings, and he wrote that name into the notebook. He saw a white mansion behind a tall iron gate, a long corridor of marble, an office with glass walls looking out over the Chicago skyline, and he wrote Chicago into the notebook. Then one night he saw the face of a teenage girl, brown hair, blue eyes like his, standing at the end of a hallway, looking at him with an expression he felt before he understood it. Disappointment, the look of a child who had grown too used to being abandoned by the one person who wasn't supposed to abandon her, and he woke with tears on his cheeks and didn't know why. He wrote in the notebook, "Daughter?" ? And then, after more nights, he wrote Willa. Every fragment arrived with a violent headache, like someone swinging a hammer into his temple from the inside, and Brielle would see him late at night on the sofa, gripping his head, teeth clenched, enduring it without making a sound. But she didn't ask, because she understood there were kinds of pain that questions couldn't fix. Then one night, a storm hit Detroit without warning. The wind ripped loose the tin sheets he'd patched only a week earlier, and rain poured through the leaking roof in streams that ran across the floor. Thunder kept cracking, shaking the ground, and Poppy woke screaming in terror. Brielle picked her up and held her tight on the sofa because the floor was already flooding, and he was scrambling to set buckets under the leaks when Poppy called out, "Mister, come up here, I'm scared." He looked at Brielle like he was asking permission, and she gave a small nod, so he sat down beside them. The sofa was only wide enough for 2 adults, so the 3 of them huddled close, Poppy curled in Brielle's arms, Brielle in the middle, and him beside her. The thunder kept rolling, and every time it hit, Poppy burrowed deeper into her mother. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Poppy finally fell asleep from exhaustion, and Brielle started to drift too, her head tipping little by little until it rested on his shoulder without her even realizing it. Warmth from his body seeped through the thin fabric of the old shirt, and Brielle slept deeper than she had in 4 years, because for the first time, there was a shoulder there. He didn't move. He didn't breathe too loud. He held perfectly still like a statue so she could lean, and in the darkness, with rain rattling on the tin roof, he looked down at the top of her head, at hair thinned by malnutrition, at the small scar on her forehead he'd never dared ask about. And in that moment, his eyes said things his mouth would never be able to say. Things he maybe couldn't even name yet himself. Brielle startled awake when the sky was close to dawn and realized she'd been leaning on his shoulder. She pulled back fast like she'd touched fire, panic flashing across her face for a beat before the familiar coldness returned. She stood, lifted Poppy, and walked away without looking back. He didn't say anything either, but both of them knew something had shifted between them that night, silent and slow, like water seeping through a wall. And when Brielle set Poppy into the crib, she stood with her face turned to the wall for a long time, because she knew she was falling into something far more dangerous than anything the dump outside Detroit could ever throw at her. Brielle found the newspaper that afternoon while she was sorting a pile of old paper in the west corner of the landfill, a Chicago Tribune that was yellowed and crumpled. But the business page was still readable, and she read it because it was her habit to flip through anything with printed words before tossing it onto the paper pile for resale, because sometimes there were coupons still good tucked inside. But this time, it wasn't a coupon. It was a half-page photo of a man in a black three-piece suit, standing in front of a tall glass building, sharp, featured, eyes fixed on the camera with the chill of someone used to being photographed without needing to smile. Beside him was a woman with long black hair and a red dress, her arm looped through his. Under the photo, the bold headline said the family was pleading for help in the search for the missing CEO of Galletti Holdings. And beneath it, the article described the mysterious disappearance of Thane Galletti, 36, CEO of the Chicago-based real estate and investment firm Galletti Holdings, missing for more than 2 weeks after a private dinner, with his sister-in-law, Kendra Galletti, and Vice President Paxton Reed, coordinating with authorities to search for him. Brielle finished reading and her hands started to shake, not from fear, but because everything suddenly clicked together like puzzle pieces she'd been holding for weeks without knowing what picture they belonged to. Soft hands without calluses, commanding instincts, a voice that made an entire emergency room obey, the tattoo on his wrist, the Patek Philippe watch, and the engraving TG. She folded the newspaper and shoved it into her pocket and didn't say a word to him. Instead, she waited until night when Poppy was asleep, then went to Odette's trailer and pulled it out. Odette read it under the yellow lamp with her reading glasses, then set it down and looked at Brielle without a hint of surprise. She said she'd known from the first day, because the tattoo on his wrist wasn't a street gang tattoo. It was the kind that belonged to organized men, the kind she'd seen in the most dangerous parts of Detroit and Chicago back when she still had both legs. The question wasn't who he was, because now Brielle knew. The question was, when the wolf heals and remembers he's a wolf, does he come back and bite the one who saved him? Brielle sat silent for a long time in Odette's trailer, listening to crickets outside the door, thinking about the man who'd carried Poppy through the night, thinking about the portrait he'd drawn of her daughter, thinking about the hand he'd set on her shoulder at the clinic, and she knew that whoever he was, she owed him the truth, the same way he owed her an explanation. The next morning, when Poppy went out to play with the stray cat, Brielle sat down across from him at the kitchen table and placed the newspaper on the tabletop face down. She said, "I found this at the dump," and then she flipped it over. He looked down, and time stopped. His eyes locked on the picture of himself in that black suit in front of a glass tower in Chicago. And Brielle saw his pupils widen, then tighten, then widen again, like a camera hunting focus, and then the black wall inside his head cracked, not slowly the way small fragments had fallen loose in dreams for weeks, but shattering all at once, like someone had swung a sledgehammer into glass. He remembered. He remembered everything. He remembered the long conference table, but now he remembered every face around it. He remembered Kendra as his sister-in-law, the black-haired woman who had poured the drink that night. He remembered Paxton as his second-in-command, his right hand, the man he'd trusted most in the organization. He remembered the bitter taste because Paxton had put something in his glass. He remembered collapsing out of the chair, being dragged away, being beaten, being stuffed into a trunk, the dark. He remembered Kendra's face pale with terror in the shadows, paralyzed by Paxton's threats as he ordered his men to take Thane away, claiming they were only removing him from the board rather than leaving him for dead. He remembered those two taking his company, taking his organization, taking everything he'd built. And he remembered Willa, his daughter, in their hands, not knowing her father had been betrayed by his own family. He sat motionless for so long Brielle thought he'd slipped back into emptiness, but then he looked up, and she saw a completely different man staring out of those eyes. When he spoke, it wasn't the hoarse, fragile voice of the amnesiac who'd been lying on her sofa. It was low and cold, every syllable controlled, as if each word were a bullet being loaded into a chamber. I remember. I know who I am. I'm Thane Galletti, and I know who did this to me. Brielle leaned back in her chair. Just a small movement, but enough to tell her that her body reacted before her mind could catch up. And she was afraid. For the first time, truly afraid of this man. Not afraid he'd hit her or hurt Poppy, but afraid of the absolute cold that had dropped over his face in an instant. Afraid of how the eyes that had looked at Poppy's portrait with such gentleness had turned into two bottomless black hollows. Afraid because she realized the man who fixed pipes and told her daughter bedtime stories had vanished right in front of her. And the one sitting across from her now was someone else entirely, someone the newspaper called a CEO, but Odette called a wolf, and Brielle was starting to understand why. Thane had planned to return to Chicago the very night his memory snapped back into place. His mind was already mapping every step. Contact Joaquin first, then gather proof, then squeeze Paxton and Kendra in a single clean move. But life didn't let him follow his plan, because 2 days after the truth broke open, Odette fell. She went down right on the steps of her trailer, her crutch slipping on a rotten board she'd meant to fix but hadn't gotten to yet, and her whole body dropped with a dry, cracking sound Brielle heard from across the empty lot, and she knew instantly it was bone because she'd heard that sound once when her mother fell out of her hospital bed the year Brielle was 18. The ambulance came 40 minutes later, because this was the kind of outer edge where everything arrived late, even hope. And they took Odette to the public hospital, where the doctor said her hip was fractured and she needed a replacement surgery, the cost climbing into tens of thousands of dollars, and her veterans VA insurance would cover only a small part, because she was past the age limit for that surgery package, and the rest was a number Brielle stared at like it was a cliff. She stood in the hospital corridor with Poppy in her arms, not crying, because she'd forgotten how to cry a long time ago, but her eyes were empty in a way Thane recognized as worse than tears, the look of someone who was exhausted all the way down. She spoke into the air more than to him, saying Odette was the only one who watched Poppy when she went to work. If Odette didn't get surgery, she'd be bedridden. If she was bedridden, Brielle would lose childcare. If she lost childcare, she couldn't work. If she couldn't work, everything would collapse. Her voice stayed flat, like she was reading out a sentence she'd memorized years ago. Thane listened without speaking. His gaze dropped to his wrist, where the Patek Philippe still sat, a watch worth hundreds of thousands. The last thing tying him to Thane Galletti, Chicago kingpin, the only proof of who he was beyond the small notebook filled with memory fragments. He unclasped it without a word. He walked out of the hospital, asked for directions to the nearest pawn shop, and spent 2 hours walking under the Detroit sun to a small storefront on Michigan Avenue, where the owner examined the watch with a loupe, then looked at him with suspicion. Thane knew the watch was worth more than this shabby pawn shop put together, but he had no paperwork, no time, and no options, so he accepted a price far below its true value, but enough to cover Odette's surgery. He walked back to the hospital, set a thick stack of cash on the reception counter, and said, "Do her surgery now." Then he went back to the trailer with an empty wrist that felt lighter, and a chest that felt heavier, because he'd just sold the last thing that belonged to the old version of himself. When he got back, Brielle was there. She already knew because the hospital had called to say someone had paid. She looked at his bare wrist, then into his eyes, and she didn't say thank you, because she understood those 2 words weren't big enough to hold what he'd just done. Instead, she went into the kitchen and cooked the best meal she could make with what was in the cabinets: fried eggs with onions and potatoes, white rice in a dented aluminum pot, and a can of black beans she'd been saving for next week, but opened anyway. She put the biggest portion in front of him, the best parts, the largest pieces, the way people show gratitude in places where words are a luxury but food is everything. Thane ate in silence, and each bite slowed more than the last, because he was tasting something no Michelin-star dinner in Chicago had ever given him, the flavor of a meal cooked by someone who had put him ahead of herself. And in that quiet, he realized this was the best meal of his life, even though it was only fried eggs and black beans inside a leaking trailer on the edge of a dump. He'd intended to leave that night, his plan already arranged in his mind, step by step. But when Brielle went to her evening dishwashing shift, and he stayed to watch Poppy, the child ran a mild fever and lay in the crib fussing, refusing to sleep until he picked her up and told her a story. He didn't even know what he was saying. Maybe he was making it up, because his memory was back, but he didn't have any fairy tales inside it. But Poppy listened, eyes wide, then heavy, then closing, her small hand curling around his finger, and in a drowsy voice that Brielle heard the moment she reached the trailer door, Poppy said, "Good night, Daddy." Brielle stood outside with her hands still wet with dish soap from the diner, and she heard her daughter call that man Daddy for the first time in Poppy's life, and she had to grip the doorframe because her knees went soft. Thane sat beside the crib looking down at the sleeping child, and he knew he couldn't leave tonight. He couldn't leave tomorrow. A few more days turned into a week, then 2, and in that time he became the man Poppy ran to every morning, the one she asked for whenever she couldn't see him, the father shape she'd never had now, wearing the sharp-featured face of a dethroned mafia boss, hiding in a trailer on the edge of a dump outside Detroit. And that contradiction was so beautiful and so painful that Thane Galletti, the man no one in Chicago dared make wait, stayed willingly each night sitting beside an old crib, waiting until a 4-year-old took his hand before he allowed himself to close his eyes. Paxton wasn't stupid, and that was what made him dangerous, because after more than a month of not finding Thane's body in any morgue from Chicago to Detroit, he started to suspect the prey might still be alive, and he shifted from searching for a corpse to hunting a man, this time with method. He sent 3 of his men to Detroit, with Thane's photo printed out, posting it at every pawn shop, every cheap bar, every scrapyard within a 20-mile radius of the area where he'd ordered the body dumped that night. And it was the Patek Philippe that betrayed Thane, because the pawn shop owner on Michigan Avenue, the same man who'd peered at the watch through a loop a week earlier, took one look at the photo. Paxton's men showed him and nodded immediately. Nobody forgot the face of a man who walked a Patek Philippe into a bargain pawn shop outside Detroit. The owner pointed west and said the man had walked back toward the trailer park near the industrial dump. Brielle got off work earlier than usual that afternoon because the diner had closed early after a water pipe burst, and she was walking home with Poppy when she saw a black SUV parked at the entrance of the dirt road that led into the trailer park, 2 men in black jackets standing there talking to the neighbor, 3 trailers down from her. The survival instinct she'd honed for 27 years snapped on. She didn't run, because running was the fastest way to be noticed. She stayed calm, crouched to Poppy's level, and told her, "Let's play hide and seek, okay? Follow Mommy and be very quiet." Poppy nodded, thrilled, because she thought it was a game. Brielle led her the long way behind the line of trailers, slipped through a gap in the fence only she knew, and entered through the back door. Inside, Thane was sitting on the sofa. She spoke fast, her voice not shaking but sharp as a blade. "Someone's looking for you outside. Get under the trailer, right now." Thane didn't ask questions. The instincts of a man who'd lived in the underworld made him move before he thought. He lifted the floorboard she'd shown him the week before, when he'd been fixing the plumbing, and slid down into the space between the trailer floor and the ground, tight, pitch dark, stinking of damp earth and rats, but enough for a man to lie flat. Brielle set the board back in place, pulled the old rug over it, lifted Poppy onto her hip, and sat on the sofa, drawing a deep breath and waiting. The knock came 5 minutes later. 3 hard raps, not the kind a neighbor used when borrowing sugar, the kind used by someone who expected the door to open. Brielle opened with Poppy on her hip and looked at the 2 men with the tired, slightly irritated expression of a single mother being bothered in the middle of the afternoon. One of them held up Thane's photo and asked if she'd seen this man. Brielle glanced at the picture, the man in the black suit in front of a glass building, and she gave a short laugh, the laugh of someone used to being underestimated. "That guy looks like Wall Street. What do you think he'd be doing out here? There's nothing here but rats, roaches, and rotten trailers. Go look for him at a country club or a golf course. Not here." Poppy looked at the men, then buried her face into her mother's neck. And one of the men scanned the filthy little trailer, took in the child wearing a cloth mask, took in the thin woman with scarred hands, and clearly decided there was no reason Thane Galletti would ever show up in this hellhole. So they nodded and left. Under the trailer, Thane lay in the dark and heard everything through the thin wooden floor. He heard Brielle's voice, calm to the point of cold. He heard the men's footsteps. He heard the door shut. And then he heard Brielle's heartbeat, fast and hard, traveling through the boards into the earth where he lay with his cheek pressed into mud. And he knew she had been afraid enough that her heart wanted to leap out of her chest, but her voice hadn't trembled for a second. In that moment, Lying beneath a trailer that reeked of dead rats on the outskirts of Detroit, Thane Galletti swore to himself that he wouldn't let anyone on this earth touch that woman or that child, even if he had to burn all of Chicago to ash. That night, after Poppy fell asleep, Thane walked to the payphone 1.5 miles from the trailer park and called Joaquin Herrera. On the phone, his voice was Thane Galletti, the boss, not the man who drew butterflies for a child. He gave short orders. Prepare the paperwork. Freeze the accounts. Collect proof of Paxton's illegal transactions. I'll be back in 2 days. On the other end, Joaquin was silent for a beat, then said, "Yes, sir." The night before he left, Thane sat on the trailer steps, staring up at a Detroit sky with no stars, washed out by factory lights and pollution, and Brielle came out and sat beside him with enough distance that they didn't touch, but close enough to feel warmth. She didn't look at him. She stared into the darkness ahead and asked in the flat voice he'd learned to hear the emotion beneath, "What kind of man are you going back as? The one who fixes my pipes, or the boss the whole city of Chicago fears?" Thane wanted to answer, but he couldn't lie to her, because she was the last person on earth he wanted to lie to. So he stayed quiet, and that silence was the most honest answer he had. Then he went inside, bent over Poppy, and kissed her forehead for a long time, as if he wanted to carve the scent of her hair into his bones. And he slipped an envelope of cash under Brielle's pillow, the remaining money from selling the watch that he'd kept for the trip back to Chicago, but now he'd find another way. He left in the night without looking back, because he knew if he looked back, he wouldn't be able to go. Brielle sat on the steps listening to his footsteps fade along the dirt road until there was nothing, and she didn't cry, because she was used to men leaving. Her father had left, her boyfriend had left, and now this man was leaving too, and the only difference was that this time, something inside her cracked that she hadn't known was still whole until the moment it broke. Thane reached Chicago at dawn, on a Greyhound bus ticket Joaquin had already bought, so he could be waiting at the station for him. For 12 hours on that bus, Thane didn't sleep. He sat by the window and watched America slide backward, Michigan fields giving way to Indiana factories, until the Chicago skyline rose in the early haze like the steel teeth of a massive beast, and he felt like he wasn't going home. He was going back to a battlefield. Joaquin met him at a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. The older attorney almost didn't recognize him, because the Thane Galletti he knew wore tailored suits and had skin so pale it looked like it had never met the sun. But the man standing in front of him now was tanned, thinner, hands marked with fresh calluses, wearing old jeans and a faded t-shirt, yet his eyes were the same. Still the eyes no one in Chicago dared hold for more than 3 seconds. Joaquin had prepared everything as ordered. Account documents, evidence of Paxton's illegal transactions during Thane's disappearance, records of transfers and laundering through 3 shell companies Paxton had set up. Minutes from the board meeting Paxton had called to vote himself in as interim CEO. Thane read every page with the cold calm of a man used to reading a sentence before carrying it out. He showered, shaved, put on the new suit Joaquin had bought, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw Thane Galletti looking back. But something was different. In the eyes of the man in the mirror lived the shadow of a leaking trailer, the scarred hands of a woman, and the smile of a 4-year-old calling him Daddy. He walked into Galletti Holdings at 10 in the morning, Chicago sun blasting the glass face of the tower, and the lobby security guard nearly dropped his radio when he saw Thane step through the revolving doors. Thane didn't stop, didn't explain. He went straight to the elevator and pressed the top floor, where the main boardroom and the CEO office were, where Paxton was sitting now. The boardroom doors opened, and Thane stepped in, while Paxton sat at the head of the table, in the chair Thane had held for 12 years, champagne flute in hand, and Kendra stood beside him with a glass too. The 2 traders were laughing in the middle of a weekday morning, as if the world belonged to them, and the rightful owner had died somewhere out by a dump. Silence crashed down over the room like someone had shut off the sound in the entire building. Kendra saw him first, and her champagne slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. But no one heard it, because the silence was louder than any noise. Her face went white. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Paxton turned, and his face ran through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Shock, then fear, then the fake smile Thane had seen every night in those trailer dreams. He rose with his arms open and said, "Thane, my God, you're alive. We've been searching everywhere for you." Thane said nothing. He pulled out a chair and sat, not in the seat of power, but in a guest position, and he looked at Paxton with the gaze of a cat, watching a mouse before it strikes. Calm, patient, and absolutely ruthless. He spoke in a low, slow voice. "I see you've been keeping my seat warm, Paxton. Thank you." Then he smiled, and the smile made Kendra step back, because it didn't reach his eyes. Thane didn't accuse them right away. He played cat and mouse for 3 days. He called a board meeting as the officially reinstated CEO. And in that meeting, he laid out every page of evidence of Paxton's illegal transactions. Every number, every signature, every shell account, and he presented it in the steady tone of a man reading an annual report, while Paxton's face shifted from red to white to gray. The board voted unanimously to strip Paxton of all authority, and the FBI was already waiting in the lobby with an arrest warrant, because Joaquin had sent them the laundering file 2 days earlier. Kendra was thrown out of the Galletti family estate that same afternoon. She walked through the gate with 2 suitcases, and the eyes of someone unmasked in broad daylight. But none of it, not the company, not the power, not the money, was what made Thane's hands shake as he drove back to the Lincoln Park mansion that night, because what scared him more than facing Paxton was facing his daughter. Willa sat on the steps inside the house when he opened the door and walked in. 15 years old, brown hair, blue eyes exactly like his, the same face from his trailer dreams. She looked at him with a coldness he knew he'd earned. "Aunt Kendra says you left because you were tired of this family," she said, her voice flat, without emotion. And Thane recognized that voice because it sounded exactly like Brielle's when she tried to hide pain. "Aunt Kendra says, you didn't want me anymore." It hit him like a knife to the chest, because every word Willa spoke was a lie Kendra had fed his daughter while he was missing, and he wanted to roar with fury, but he didn't. Instead, he did something the old Thane Galletti never would have done. He sat down on the floor right in front of Willa so his eyes were level with hers, and he spoke in a voice he'd learned in that Detroit trailer. The voice of a man who knew he was wrong and didn't run from it. "I didn't leave, Willa. I was taken, and I'll tell you everything. But first I need to say I'm sorry, because even before that happened, I wasn't here enough for you, and that was my fault, not anyone else's." Willa stared at her father on the floor in front of her, the man she remembered as always standing above, always busy, always behind a closed door, now sitting on the ground looking up with wet eyes. She saw calluses on his hands that hadn't been there before. She saw the new scar on his forehead. She understood that whatever had happened, her father had passed through a place that changed him. And for the first time in 3 years, she cried. Not from anger, but from relief. She slid down from the step and wrapped her arms around him, and Thane held his daughter so tight he was afraid he'd break her. But Willa didn't let go. And neither did he, and father and daughter sat on the floor of the Lincoln Park mansion, holding each other and crying in silence for all the days they'd lost. A week after taking back everything in Chicago, Thane drove Willa to Detroit, because she'd asked every day since the night her father sat on the floor and told her about the woman and the little girl who had saved him. Willa wanted to meet them, and Thane knew he couldn't keep telling the story without letting his daughter see with her own eyes the world that had taught him how to be human. Willa sat in the passenger seat staring out the Mercedes window the entire drive. And as the scenery shifted from bright highway lights to cracked dirt roads, and then to rows of rusted trailers on the edge of an industrial dump, her expression moved from curiosity to unease to shock, and she whispered, "Dad, people really live here." Thane nodded and said yes, and I lived here for weeks, and those were the most important weeks of my life. When the Mercedes rolled to a stop in front of Brielle's trailer, the door flew open, and Poppy shot out like a tiny bullet, sprinting on short legs across the open lot and slamming into Thane's legs, hugging him tight like she was afraid he'd vanish again. She looked up and shrieked in a high voice. The whole trailer park could hear. "You're back. You're back. Mom, he's back." And Thane bent down, lifted her into his arms, and this time he couldn't hide what he felt. His eyes went red and he held her close. Brielle stood in the doorway watching, her gaze flicking from the Mercedes to the suit Thane wore to Willa standing beside the car, staring at Poppy with wide eyes. And Brielle understood that the man in front of her now wasn't the one who fixed pipes in her trailer. He was Thane Galletti, Chicago's boss, back on his throne. She nodded a greeting with the coolness she wore like armor, and invited them inside. Thane introduced Willa and said, "This is Brielle and Poppy, the 2 people I owe my life to." Then he looked at Brielle and said, "This is Willa, my daughter." The 2 girls looked at each other. Willa was 15, wearing a designer top, $300 sneakers, brown hair cut at the most expensive salon in Chicago. Poppy was 4, barefoot in a faded old t-shirt, messy curls, smiling like the whole world belonged to her. Poppy stared at Willa and said, "You're so pretty. Do you want to see Poppy's stray cat?" And she grabbed Willa's hand and pulled her outside without waiting for an answer. Willa got dragged along by that tiny hand before she could react, looking back at her father with an expression that was half alarmed and half delighted. That night, Brielle made mac and cheese from the cheapest box at the dollar store, and Willa sat on an old plastic chair in the cramped trailer, staring at the yellow pasta on her plate, then watching Poppy eat happily, and watching Thane eat with a kind of gratitude she'd never seen in him before. She lifted her fork, took the first bite, and realized that mac and cheese in a trailer on the edge of a dump carried a flavor the most expensive Italian restaurant in Chicago didn't have. Maybe the taste of being grateful for food for the first time. After dinner, while Willa and Poppy sat out on the trailer steps looking at the stars, Thane told Brielle in the kitchen that he wanted to bring her and Poppy back to Chicago, get Poppy the best doctors, get Brielle back in school, give them both a decent life, and he said it in the voice of a man who solved problems with money. Brielle set the pot she was washing into the sink and turned to him, her voice not loud, but sharp as broken glass out at the dump. "I'm not a dog you picked up to keep, Thane. I didn't save you so you could pay me back with money. If you want to help, don't help me. Go fix the system that makes people dig through trash to survive. Fix the system where a 4-year-old with asthma has no insurance because her mother is too poor. If you can fix that, then you can call it help." Thane stood still, because no one had ever refused his money like that. No one had looked at him as if his money were an insult, and he realized she was right, and that rightness hurt more than any punch. But before he could answer, Willa ran in, with her face drained white, and screamed, "Dad, Poppy can't breathe," and everything collapsed in a single second. Brielle rushed outside and saw Poppy on the trailer steps, her chest heaving but the air not making it into her lungs, her lips blue, her eyes wide with terror. This wasn't a normal asthma flare. This was the worst attack Brielle had ever seen, and she knew the community clinic couldn't handle it this time. Thane scooped Poppy up, put her into the Mercedes, and drove like a madman toward the largest hospital in Detroit. On the way, he called Joaquin and ordered him to get the best pediatric respiratory specialist in Chicago onto a private jet to Detroit immediately, no matter what it cost. In the emergency room, the doctor said Poppy had a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung complication from chronic asthma, and she needed immediate intervention. Brielle stood outside the ER doors, staring through the glass at her daughter on the bed, swallowed by tubes and machines, so small she almost disappeared into the white sheets. And for the first time, after everything she'd endured in 27 years, Brielle Lawson broke. She didn't sob out loud. She shook. Her whole body shook like her bones were coming apart. And she said to Thane beside her in a voice he'd never heard from her before, the voice of someone who'd spent every last ounce of strength and had nothing left to keep herself standing, "I'm scared. Thane, I'm scared every night. Every night I listen to her breathe, and I count each breath, because I'm afraid one night I'll count, and the breathing will stop, and I won't be able to do anything, and I'll lose her. And if I lose her, I won't have any reason to breathe anymore." Thane reached for her, and this time it wasn't a hand on her shoulder like at the community clinic. It was an embrace that wrapped all the way around her. She collapsed against his chest, shaking, and he held her with hands that had been soft as a child's only weeks ago, but now were roughened with calluses from the Detroit dump. She didn't push him away. She didn't step back. For the first time, Brielle Lawson let someone else hold her upright because she couldn't stand alone anymore. The Chicago doctor arrived at dawn, and the procedure succeeded. Poppy made it through the danger and slept peacefully with assisted breathing, and Willa sat beside the bed, holding her hand all night, refusing to leave, because the 15-year-old had decided that this 4-year-old was her little sister, even though no one said it out loud. Kendra Galletti hit bottom on a rain-soaked afternoon in Detroit, 3 months after she was thrown out of the family estate. Paxton had been arrested by the FBI for money laundering in the first week, and from prison he never bothered to call her even once, because to him Kendra had only been a tool, and when a tool stopped being useful, you threw it away. She lost her home, her money, every social connection, because no one in Chicago wanted to touch the Galletti name after the scandal, and she drifted from cheap hotels to rooming houses to shelters, until finally there was nowhere left that would take her, and she remembered the address one of Paxton's men had reported before he was arrested, a trailer park on the edge of an industrial dump outside Detroit where Thane Galletti had been hiding, and she went there not out of hope, but because there was nowhere else to go. Brielle opened her trailer door at 9 at night and saw a woman standing in the rain, long black hair plastered to her face, clothes soaked through, a designer handbag in her hand, worn and torn, eyes swollen red from crying. Brielle recognized her instantly, because that face had been burned into her mind since the day she read the newspaper. The woman in the red dress beside Thane in the photo. Kendra, the family member whose cowardice and silence had allowed the man Brielle cared about to be betrayed and left to die in a landfill. Brielle stood in the doorway and waited for anger to explode, but it didn't come. Instead, she looked at the shaking, drenched woman in front of her and saw something that felt terrifyingly familiar. She saw herself, if life had shoved her down a different road, if she'd chosen money over Poppy, if she'd chosen a man over standing on her own feet. Kendra was a version of Brielle at another fork in the road, and that realization didn't make her pity Kendra. It made her understand. She stepped aside and said, "Come in." Kendra came inside and stared around the cramped room she wouldn't have set foot in months earlier, and all she could manage were 3 words. "I have nowhere." Brielle handed her a dry towel and a bowl of hot noodles, pointed to a corner of the floor where she could sleep tonight, and didn't ask anything else, because Brielle never asked too much of someone who was bleeding, whether the blood was on the skin or inside the chest. The next morning, Odette came over on her crutch, saw Kendra curled in the corner, and didn't bother with greetings. She said flatly that nobody ate for free here. If you want to stay, you work. Start by washing every dish in that sink, then mop the floor, then hang the laundry on the line, and she said it in the voice of a sergeant assigning duties to a new recruit. No room for negotiation. Kendra looked at the pile of dirty dishes and her hands trembled, because those hands had never washed a dish in her life. They were used to holding champagne glasses and signing checks, but she stepped to the sink, because she didn't have any other choice. In the days that followed, Odette broke Kendra's pride apart one piece at a time, with work, scrubbing floors, hanging clothes, pulling weeds, hauling trash. Every time Kendra complained, Odette would just look at her and say, "If you don't work, you don't eat." It was simple, it was brutal, and it worked, because hunger was the best teacher. Thane came to the trailer park 2 weeks later to see Brielle and Poppy, because he still drove down from Chicago every weekend. And when he walked in and saw Kendra on her knees mopping the floor, his face went rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes turning into the same cold black hollows Brielle had seen the day he remembered everything in this trailer. He turned to Brielle and said in a controlled voice, sharp as a blade, "You're letting the woman who tried to kill me stay in your house, right next to Poppy." Brielle met his gaze without flinching and answered in the calm voice he'd learned could not be moved. "You were dangerous too, and I let you stay. Odette said you were a wolf, and I still let you sleep on my sofa beside my daughter. I don't decide who deserves to be saved, Thane. I save anyone who's bleeding, because that's how my mother taught me to live before she died, and I'm not changing that because you're angry." Thane stood still, his rage slamming into the wall of her righteousness and shattering, because she was right. And he knew she was right, because he was living proof. Kendra knelt on the floor and looked up at him, tears dropping onto the tiles she'd just cleaned. And she said, "I'm sorry, Thane. I know sorry isn't enough, but I've got nothing else to give you." Thane looked down at the woman kneeling at his feet, his sister-in-law whose cowardice and silence had allowed Paxton to nearly kill him, and though she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, he still struggled to find a reason to forgive her, because some things couldn't be forgiven with a sentence. But he didn't take revenge either, because he'd learned in this trailer that revenge was a luxury for people who didn't understand the price of mercy. He spoke in a cold voice that wasn't cruel. "Live, Kendra. Live like a human being. That's the harshest punishment I can give you. Because dying is easy. Living and changing is the hard part." Then he turned away, lifted Poppy into his arms, and went out onto the steps without looking back. In the weeks that followed, Kendra changed slowly and painfully, like a snake shedding skin. Her hands went from soft to blistered to calloused, then grew used to the work. She discovered she had a gift for organizing and planning when Odette put her in charge of selling vegetables from the small garden at the flea market, and she started helping the women around the trailer park throw birthday parties for their kids with cheap supplies, arranged so beautifully. People stared in disbelief. The community moved from suspicion to acceptance, calling her Miss K, coming to her whenever they needed decorations or help putting something together. Then one day, Paxton called from federal prison, Somehow he got the number of the payphone near the trailer park and used a middleman to tell Kendra to meet him and pick up the receiver. He tried to lure her with promises of money when he got out, with a new plan. Kendra held the handset and listened until he finished. Then she answered in a voice she couldn't have had 3 months earlier, the voice of someone who had hit bottom and stood back up without anyone pulling her. "I'm poor, Paxton, but I sleep at night, and that's something you and I never had when we were rich." Then she hung up and walked back to the trailer to keep mopping, because the floor wasn't going to clean itself. In the months that followed, Thane restructured Galletti Holdings from the inside, the way a surgeon dissects a sick body to cut away each tumor. He shut down the shell companies Paxton had built, severed every laundering channel, fired the people loyal to Paxton, and replaced them with Joaquin's trusted operators, and he moved the empire out of the shadows and into the light, slowly, not because he'd suddenly turned into a good man, but because he'd seen the scarred hands of a woman digging through trash to feed her child, and he didn't want to remain part of the system that had pushed her into that landfill. But what stunned the trailer park most wasn't the glass tower in Chicago. It was the small clinic that rose on the empty lot beside Brielle's trailer. Thane had it built with his personal money, not company funds, and he didn't put his name on it. He asked Brielle what she wanted to call it, and she said she wasn't naming it yet. She'd decide later, because she was busy studying. Brielle had enrolled in the nursing program at Wayne State University in Detroit on a scholarship for low-income single mothers. Along with additional support, Thane quietly arranged through a charity fund so she wouldn't know where the money came from, because he understood that if she knew, she'd refuse. She studied during the day, managed the clinic in the afternoons, and came home at night to cook for Poppy. Odette had recovered enough to watch Poppy while Brielle went to class, and their life ran on a tight schedule with no minutes wasted. Willa took the Greyhound bus from Chicago to Detroit every school break without her father driving her, because she wanted to go on her own, and every time she arrived, she carried a suitcase of books for Poppy. She sat on the trailer floor teaching Poppy the alphabet one letter at a time, and Poppy taught Willa in return how to catch crickets, how to feel which way the wind was moving, how to make joy out of a dull pencil in the back of a flyer. The two girls traded worlds like gifts, and each of them came away richer after every visit. Once at her private school in Chicago, a classmate asked Willa why she kept going to Detroit, who she was visiting in that slum. Willa looked straight into the girl's eyes and said, "I'm visiting my little sister, and if you call where my sister lives a slum one more time, I'll make sure it's the last time you ever speak to me." She lost a few friends after that, but she didn't care, because she'd learned from Brielle that relationships bought with silence in the face of injustice weren't worth keeping. Kendra became Miss K to the entire trailer park. She organized birthdays, baby showers, kindergarten graduations for the neighbors' kids on a budget that was almost nothing, yet made them so beautiful that people took photos and posted them online, and soon families from other areas started hiring her. She earned money with her own hands for the first time in her life, and the feeling made her understand why Brielle never accepted money from anyone. Thane drove from Chicago to Detroit every Friday night and returned every Monday morning. He ate dinner in the cramped trailer with Brielle and Poppy, even though he could have reserved a table at any restaurant in America. He sat on an old plastic chair, ate whatever Brielle cooked, and told Poppy stories before she fell asleep. And every night like that, he would look out the trailer window at the factory lights blinking on the horizon and know that he'd built a billion-dollar empire, yet it took losing everything, being dumped at a landfill, and living in a leaking trailer to understand that success was meaningless if he ended each day in an empty house, and that was a lesson no business school taught. But a dump outside Detroit had taught him with stench and love. Odette never fully recovered after the hip surgery, even though the doctors called it a success, because at 67, with a prosthetic leg and a body that had survived 2 deployments in Iraq and 20 years in a trailer park, success only meant she wasn't dead. It didn't mean she was well. She walked slower, breathed heavier, and the hands that had stitched wounds on a battlefield now trembled when she lifted a coffee cup, and Brielle saw that change every day because she was a nurse, and she knew how to read the signs most people missed: shorter breaths, swollen ankles, a faint bluish tint at the fingertips. Odette's heart was weakening, and Brielle knew it, but she didn't say it, because there were truths that didn't change anything except make the time left feel heavier. One autumn evening, when the leaves in Detroit began turning yellow, and the air carried that cold smoke smell that meant winter was coming, Odette called everyone over. She called Brielle and Poppy from the trailer next door, called Kendra from the small room she rented at the end of the row, and called Thane too, because it was Friday and he'd just driven down from Chicago. Odette sat in the old armchair in her trailer, the same chair she'd sat in for 20 years since coming home from Iraq. And she looked at each of them with eyes still bright, eyes age and illness hadn't managed to dull. She looked at Brielle first and said, "Girl, you did something I'm not sure I would have been brave enough to do. You saved a wolf and turned him into a man, and that's a miracle, not the kind from fairy tales, the kind made by people who've got nothing but a heart and still choose to give instead of keep." Then she looked at Thane, and her voice hardened, like a sergeant giving final orders to a private before discharge. "And you, son, don't you ever forget the smell of garbage, because that's where you learned who you really are. You can go back to wearing suits and sitting in leather chairs, but if you forget the smell of garbage, you'll forget the lesson, and I don't forgive people who waste a lesson." Then she waved Poppy closer, and the child climbed into her lap, and even weak, Odette held her with arms that still had enough strength. She said, "You're the light in the landfill, baby girl. You were born in the darkest place, but you shine the brightest, and don't you ever let anyone tell you where you came from matters more than where you're going." Poppy wrapped her arms around Odette's neck and said, "Don't be sad, Grandma. I love you." And Odette smiled, the last smile every person in that room would remember, beautiful in the way only people who have truly lived can smile. That night, Odette went to sleep in her trailer and didn't wake up. She passed in peaceful sleep with the smile still resting on her mouth, and Brielle was the one who found her at dawn when she carried over coffee the way she did every morning. She set the cup on the table and sat beside her for a long time, holding the hand that had gone cold. And she didn't cry right then, because the grief was too big to leave her all at once. It would leak out slowly over months, over years. Odette's funeral drew a crowd bigger than anyone in the trailer park had ever imagined. The trailer park neighbors came in the cleanest clothes they owned. The Chicago businessmen Thane invited stood in black suits beside working men in worn flannel shirts. Odette's veteran buddies from Iraq flew in wearing uniforms, saluting one last time over the casket, and no one could tell who was rich and who was poor, because tears looked the same on every face. Brielle stood at the casket and read the eulogy in a shaking voice that never broke. She said Odette left no money to anyone, because she had no money to leave, but she left something far more expensive than money. She left all of them a way of seeing people, not by the clothes they wore or the cars they drove, but by what they did when nobody was watching. And Odette had lived exactly the way she taught, all the way to her last breath. Thane stood behind her holding Poppy while the child cried into his shoulder, and he stared at the flag-draped coffin and knew the woman inside had saved him as much as Brielle had, because Odette was the one who had allowed Brielle to save him on that first night, even when she knew he was a wolf. The week after, Brielle hung a new sign on the clinic. Odette's hands, because those hands had stitched wounds under fire, stitched the gash on Thane's head inside a trailer, held Poppy's hand while she took her first steps on landfill ground. And now those hands would keep healing through the clinic that carried her name, for as long as anyone still needed to be healed, in a place the world had forgotten. Years passed, and the trailer park on the edge of the industrial dump outside Detroit was no longer a place the map forgot, because Odette's hands had grown from that first small room into a clean, warm, 2-story building with a pediatric clinic, a pulmonary clinic, mental health counseling, and a small garden out front planted with sunflowers. Because Poppy said they were Odette's favorite, even though nobody truly knew what flowers Odette liked. But Poppy believed it, and nobody wanted to tell her otherwise. Poppy was a teenager now, taller than her mother by a full head, her lungs strong after years of proper treatment, and she was studying pre-med at Wayne State University, the same school her mother had graduated from as a nurse. Poppy said she wanted to become a pediatric pulmonologist, because she wanted no child to ever have to sit in a steamy bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning just because a mother couldn't afford an inhaler. Willa graduated with a degree in architecture, and instead of working for firms that designed million-dollar mansions, she chose social housing for low-income communities. Her first project was redesigning the old trailer park into a compact, clean housing community, with rent working people could actually pay. And in her plans, every home had a large window, because she said everyone deserved enough light. Kendra, or Miss K, as everyone called her, became the most widely known community event organizer on the east side of Detroit. She ran charity fairs, graduations, weddings for hundreds of low-income families, and every event was beautiful and warm, marked by the hands of someone who had once had everything, lost everything, and built herself back up from ash. Brielle and Thane's wedding took place on a late autumn afternoon right on the grounds of Odette's hands. Not the $1,000,000 wedding Thane could have thrown, but the wedding Brielle wanted. White plastic chairs in neat rows on the small lawn, sunflowers in recycled glass jars, string lights hanging from the branches of an old oak, food organized by Kendra with the neighbors' help, Southern-style beef stew, grilled corn, mac and cheese Willa made using Brielle's recipe, and a 3-tier cake the bakery owner from the trailer park made for free because she said Brielle had treated her grandchild without charging a cent, and the cake was the least she could do. The guests were the trailer park neighbors in the nicest clothes they owned, Chicago business people, Odette's old Iraq buddies, nurses and doctors from the clinic, and Joaquin Herrera in the front row wiping his eyes with a neatly folded handkerchief. Kendra sat in the very back row. She wore a simple dress she'd bought with money she earned herself, and she cried quietly. Not from sadness, but because she was looking at living proof that people could change and be forgiven, not through words, but through time and action. Thane walked Brielle to the front, under an arch Willa had built from reclaimed wood. He wore a suit, but no shoes, because Brielle told him if he was marrying her, he was marrying her on the earth, not on marble. Thane walked barefoot through the grass, and it felt more right than any time he'd ever walked in $1,000 shoes across a mansion floor. In front of everyone, Thane spoke in a voice nobody in Chicago would have recognized, because it wasn't cold or controlled. It shook, and it was real. Years ago, I came to this broken place with no memory. A woman and her daughter picked me up out of a landfill and rebuilt me. I didn't deserve that then, but I've spent every day since trying to become someone who does. And today I'm asking her to give me a lifetime to keep trying. Brielle didn't say a word. She only gripped his hand tighter, and that was enough. After the wedding, when the guests had gone home and the string lights still glowed on the oak branches, Poppy took Thane's hand and led him behind the clinic, to where the old industrial dump had been closed and turned into a green park through a project Thane funded and Willa designed. Grass grew thick over what had once been mountains of waste, and stone benches sat beneath young trees. Poppy stopped at one spot and asked, "Dad, is this where Mom found you?" Thane looked around at the green grass, the new trees, the Detroit sky shifting from orange to purple in sunset, and he nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, right here. This is where I was lying in the trash, and you and your mom dragged me home." Poppy squeezed his hand and said, "You're so lucky." Thane bent and looked at his daughter, at the bright, healthy, round eyes that had once been squeezed shut on an emergency room bed, and he said, "I'm lucky because I lost everything to find the only thing that mattered." They sat together on the stone bench, watching the Detroit sun fade, and Thane Galletti, the Mafia boss who once made all of Chicago shake, sat barefoot on a park bench outside Detroit, holding the hand of a daughter who wasn't his by blood, and for the first time in his life, he understood peace. Not peace because there were no enemies, but peace because he knew that even if enemies came, he had someone to protect, and he had people who protected him, and that was something money, power, and an underworld empire could never buy. Thane and Brielle's story wasn't a fairy tale, because fairy tales are pretty from the start, and this story began in a landfill, with blood, fear, hunger, and the choice of a poor woman who decided to drag a stranger home instead of walking away. The lesson of this story isn't that the rich need the poor to save them, or the poor need the rich to rescue them. It's that all of us need each other, and real love never asks what you've got in your pocket before deciding whether to help. A true legacy isn't money in the bank. It's love turned into action every day. It's hands reaching out when nobody's watching. It's a meal shared when there isn't enough. It's an old plastic chair that somehow always has room for one more person. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the right story, at the right time, can change how someone sees life. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more moving stories every day. We'd truly love to hear what you think about this story, and what it reminds you of in your own real life. So please share your feelings from deep in your heart in the comments below, because every comment you leave is motivation for us to keep telling stories like this. Wishing everyone watching this video strong health, a happy life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.